Hi, we'll be reading about ETFs, exchange traded funds, which is the first topic in the portfolio management. It's also a new topic that has been added in 2020. Now we will start with a very brief history. ETFs were brought in 1990s. They were brought in because of the low management cost that they have. Then they have this transparency that mutual funds sometimes don't, and which is why they are very similar to mutual funds and yet very different. So what happens in mutual fund is that there is a portfolio manager who actively chooses what are going to be my basket of securities for this specific mutual fund. And just like mutual funds, ETFs can also be theme based. There can be an ETF of infrastructure, there can be a banking ETF, or green energy, or any theme basically, just like a mutual fund. The only main difference is that mutual funds are bought and sold at the end of the day net asset value, while ETFs, they trade in the market throughout the day. They have a real time net asset value, and that is what they traded at. They're actually traded at last trading price. But yeah, so they are real time in market. You do not have to wait for the end of the day to get the NAV. Then the management is passive. Nobody is actually sitting and picking out stocks for you. It is all done based on one formula that basically governs the whole ETF, and it's what is going to be its participant. Now, ETFs, you can use derivative strategies, you can use leverage, you can short them. So they are even in alternate structures like ETNs. So of course all of them have their own set of unique risks, but this is basically a short intro of how they are very similar yet very different from the mutual funds. Now, to understand the mechanics of ETF, so one thing I would love to say is that it is very beautifully financially engineered, and it was I was reading about its history, and it was engineered after a crisis, and then they thought that what is that can solve a situation like this to never come again, and that is how the ETF had been born. There were years and years of thought behind it. There was years of regulatory approvals to be sought. There were years of how this mechanics is going to be. Then authorized participants were brought into picture, sponsors were brought into picture, and very beautifully what exists right now is the mechanics. Now, there are two markets, so I'll try to do it over here. So, the two markets, this is the primary market and this is the secondary market. They're very similar to any other primary and secondary market. So, secondary market has buyers, has sellers, and also have something called authorized participants. These are these are a special group of institutional investors which are called authorized participants. They have the power to redeem and create more ETFs. Now, in primary market, there are sponsors and there are authorized participants. So, sponsors would be somebody like BlackRock for iShares. So those would be sponsors. These are your authorized participants. In the market, you have normal your buyers, your sellers, just like any other secondary and primary market. Now, every ETF has INAV. INAV is nothing but intraday net asset value and a creation and redemption basket. So every day, a creation and redemption basket is disclosed by the sponsor, which is basically what are the constituents of my ETF. And if an authorized participant wants to issue a new ETF, what they do is they issue a new ETF and then they buy these securities, this creation basket from the market. And at the end of the day, it takes this creation baskets and gives it back to the sponsor and says that okay, so here are the creation baskets, please issue these many ETFs, or the other way around, they short the basket, and then they come and tell them that, okay, can you please give me one unit of the ETFs? I mean, can you please take 1 year of the ETFs? So this is how this works. Authorized participants, to be kept in mind, they're a group of specialized institutional investors who make this market, and ETFs are not actively managed. There's nobody picking stocks in the background. These are managed by a formula, and I think that is pretty much about the mechanics. Now, one question is that why would somebody engage in something like this? Why would an AP want to go through all that problem? So the answer is arbitrage value. So what happens is when you have the secondary market over here, so you have the buyers, you have the seller. Let's say at one point in time the buyers exceed the sellers in number. The I now is let's say $20, which means that $20 worth of securities is what makes that ETF. But because of the demand being more than the supply, the LTP, which is the last traded price, is let's say $30. Okay. So now at this point, this authorized participant, what he's going to do is he's going to buy these $20 worth of shares and create these $30 worth of ETFs. Now, of course, there is an arbitrage profit that they make, but don't be fooled by this $10 amount. There are other costs also that they incur. So these costs include any ETF trading fee, processing fee with the sponsor, then settlement costs, bid ask spreads for these securities that they have bought. So they basically profit from the arbitrage, and they also, like, their costs are the bid ask spread and processing fee and everything. And also, uh, so LTP is not as simple as one number. The authorized participant would also have his own bid ask spread as well. So he might say that, okay, I bought this at 30, but I'm going to sell it at 30.35. So I mean, I'll buy an ETF at 30 and sell an ETF at 30.35. So they have their own bid ask spreads as well, and that is how they profit from this. Alright, so next is the trading process and settlement process. Honestly, I'm not sure how important this is, but generally in CFA, when there are a lot of proper nouns used somewhere, it's not very important generally, but it's okay. We should not skip something. So we will read about two different trading and settlement processes. One is what is done in Europe, and one is what is done in US. In US, we have DTC, which is a depository trust company, which overlooks NSCC, which is National Security Cleaning Corporation. Now, at the end of the day, all trades are given to NSCC, which becomes the guarantor of these trades. They mark these trades executed as of when they happen. Now, DTC holds the books of accounts, and then they, you know, hold the books of accounts. When they say hold the books of accounts, they mean that, let's say, JP Morgan owes Bank of America some 300 something ETFs, and Bank of America owes Goldman Sachs the some same 300 ETFs. So they would cancel these out and make this JPM to GS, and now both JPM and GS would have 2 days to settle, which is why the settlements are called T+3. For market makers, they can take up to 6 days to settle their accounts. For Europe, the process is pretty much the same. The only difference is that the clearing mechanism is not centralized at one place. There are 29 different central security depositories. So, this sometimes results in higher spreads because there are localized trading markets happening, so the spreads might be slightly higher. Now in the next topic we'll be reading about few things, that is to understand an ETF. Now we're going deeper into the mechanics which we just read. We'll do a complete deep dive into that. Would be, so to understand an ETF you need to know that would be the expense ratio of it, the index tracking of it, the tax treatment, the potential costs and risks. So the major things are expense ratio, then there are index tracking, and there would be tracking costs and all in this topic. Then there is tax treatment, which is actually a very uh, I would say confusing topic for me at least. Then there are potential costs. Then what are the risks? Okay, so these are the five things that you need to know about every ETF, to be specific. So this is what we're going to deep dive into one by one. Okay, let's talk about yeah, let's talk about expense ratio. So expense ratio is basically a small fee that's charged for managing an ETF. It is generally lower than a mutual fund because because of a few reasons. One is mutual funds have to communicate to their investors, and they have to pay for research, they have to pay the portfolio manager for picking out their stocks. So none of those expenses actually exist for an ETF, which is why the expense ratios are ridiculously low. And there is very strict competition uh, in the ETF market, so the expense ratios are all time low. And because there is a lot of leverage of technology over here, because the whole of the ETF is actually managed just by a formula or a replication of an index, so it's much more cheaper to manage ETF. Now, like what the cost depend, the things that the cost depends on are the size of ETF. Then is, let's say if you want to manage an index that has 50 funds, and as compared to you want to manage an index that has 5,000 different stocks. I mean, a little exaggerated, but just an example. Of course, the value is going to be higher for this because you're going to be paying bid ask spreads and stuff like that. Second is how often the balancing happens. So some ETFs rebalance quarterly, some ETFs rebalance daily as well. Based on that, what is the portfolio complexity? Then what is the issuer size? There is economy of scale involved, which is why you'll see that Vanguard and BlackRock have ridiculously cheap ETFs. Then again, how is the competitive landscape for these ETFs? This all matters when you look at the expense ratio. So, just to give you an idea of how big the expense ratio is, at the end of 2018, the expense ratio for broad based capitalization weighted index were as low as 0.03% in US equities. Okay, and 0.11 for emerging market equities. So that is what I'm talking about, pretty low. That is what the expense ratios are, they're very low. Now the next thing is index tracking and index tracking error. So there is always a slight difference between the index performance and the ETF performance. This is called tracking error because of a few reasons why this could happen. So how do we measure index tracking? How do we measure the difference? The tracking error is we can take daily differences, we can see through them, and but this is not really considered very efficient because we generally would like to see it over a broader period of time, a mean of the tracking errors. So we do something periodic like a yearly or a 12-month rolling average, and 12-month rolling average is much better because they can now this percentage can also be directly compared to your expense ratio, and you can come up with one number that if I add up my tracking error and I add up my expense ratio, this is the number which I have. So now, going to the sources of your index tracking errors. Okay, just give me a second. Sources of tracking error. There are different sources. There are fee and expenses. Okay, so indexes basically assume that all the trading is frictionless, which is not true with the ETFs. They have to actually incur fee and expenses for trading. So that is one difference. When you look at the returns in an ETF and returns of the index, there would be some differences. Second is a representative sample. So sometimes what would happen is, if the uh, index is very complex, or there are a lot of constituents of the index, the sponsor, what they would do is they would take a representative mm, sample. So representative sample is nothing but something that depicts and behaves just like the index, and which is why the creation basket would be very efficient. You don't have to buy 500 different shares every time you want to create a unit of ETF. So that is one. Third is index changes. If there are any changes in the index, it takes a while for them to reflect in the ETF. Then there are fund accounting practices. So accounting practices for the funds and the ETF can be different. So there can be a small difference arising because of them. Then there are regulatory costs and taxations, which are of course not a part of the index performance, because index is nothing but a fictional uh, index. So it's not incurring any of the costs like taxes and any of the regulatory costs. Then there are also asset managers operations. Now this is an interesting one. What we say here is that sometimes asset managers, to optimize their operations, what they do is they do security lending. That is, that they lend out the securities that they have bought for ETFs to, short sellers here and there, and this is how they generate a profit, and they want to give back these benefits to the index performance. So this actually would be a positive charge instead of negative one, like the others. So these are some of the sources of tracking errors.